This is No Nonsense Leadership, where we explore better ways to develop software products and services. Join world-class experts for honest insights and practical advice to help you lead digital teams clearly and confidently. Subscribe now to learn the best ideas in the field.
In this episode, we talk to Michele Zanini about Humanocracy. Mikkel emphasizes the limitations of traditional bureaucratic organizations and explains the concept of Humanocracy, which focuses on maximizing human potential rather than efficiency and control. We explore the principles of ownership, meritocracy, internal markets, experimentation, community, openness, and balance that underpin Humanocracy. And we discuss examples of successful applications at Haier and Roche that show how these principles can foster innovation, engagement, profitability, and growth. Welcome to the No Nonsense Leadership Podcast. I'm Murray Robinson.
I'm Donna Spencer.
And I'm Michele Zanini.
Hi, Michele. Thanks for coming on today.
My pleasure.
We want to talk to you about your book, Humanocracy, which you wrote with Gary Hamel. But before we start, could we get you to tell us a bit about yourself?
Sure. So I'm from Italy originally, but I've lived in the United States, Brooklyn, Massachusetts, for about 30 years. I don't have an MBA, even though I wrote a business book. And that might actually explain a little bit of my perspective and how it might be different. My first job was at the RAND Corporation, which is a public policy think tank. And there I really thought and did research around how the way the government was managed, run, and organized affected its performance. One of my first projects was thinking about how the evolution of terrorist groups into networks was making it difficult for large lumbering bureaucracy to counter them. So I did that at RAND for 5 years. Then I went to work at McKinsey. I did that for about 10 years. And then I met up with Gary, and he and I have this passion to create organizations that are fundamentally more capable, more daring, more adaptable, more creative, and more engaging than they typically are. And that's really been my mission over the last 15 years. I do research. I wrote a book called Humanocracy, and I help companies and leaders prototype and develop new management practices.
So what is Humanocracy and how is it different to a traditional organization?
So we have this belief, Gary and I, that the fundamental driver of advantage for an organization in the long term isn't its operating model, the way IT and other infrastructure is set up. It's not even the business model, the products, the value proposition, the segments, and all of those things. Those are important. But rather, it's the management model. That is, choices we make around how decisions get made and decided, which voices are heard, how resources are moved around, what priorities are set, how people are incented, and all of those things. Management is a social technology that has evolved over time, but most of that evolution has really come 100 years ago when industrial era management practices came about. And we haven't been very intentional or very ambitious in changing the way organizations are managed. And that's really the focus of the book. How can we think very radically, but also very practically about how we make those choices around the management model? And we have in the book this comparison between industrial era management practices, which we call bureaucracy, and humanocracy as a different set of practices and a different set of principles. So maybe the basic difference is this. In a bureaucracy, the person is the instrument that the organization uses to create things and drive profit or efficiency. Typically, it's efficiency and control, which are the primary factors that drive decisions around how the organization is structured and run. In a humanocracy, the relationship is actually reversed. It's the organization that is the instrument. The person is the agent, and the people use the organization to have impact. It sounds like a trivial distinction, but it's actually not if you follow through and think about how do we create an organization that amplifies human potential and human capacity as opposed to control it in a fairly narrow and rigid way. So that is the basic difference. Creating an organization where individuals and human capacity and contribution is maximized, as opposed to maximizing compliance, which is the industrial era model.
It reminds me of the distinction between a democracy and a authoritarian regime, where in an authoritarian regime, the people serve the state. But in a democracy, the state serves the people. Is that what you're getting at with a humanocracy?
Yeah, I think that's a good analogy in the sense that it puts people at the center of the system, and the whole organization is created so that human potential is unleashed and maximized so that we capture all the latent ingenuity, initiative, creativity that people have and which people typically don't bring to work. In that sense, it's similar. The organizations that I profile in the book, what I would call a humanocracy, aren't necessarily democratic in the sense that it's not like a co-op or an organization where everything gets put to a vote. Every person has the same amount of say. I think you still have differences in influence and in compensation, but these are not driven by the formal position you occupy, but it's rather focused on value added. The organization is there to help people as opposed to the other way around, but it's not a democracy. It's not socialism. It's not a co-op. These kinds of models exist in the private sector, in the public sector, in the nonprofit world. It doesn't really matter, but they're very performance-driven places. One of the debates Gary and I were having when we call this a humanocracy is that people might confuse it with workplaces that are gentle on individuals or not demanding. And in all these places, there's a lot of respect for the individual and for human agency, but they're not places where you can coast and not perform. Some of them are actually quite demanding work environments.
Can you talk about bureaucratic drag? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so if you think about the capabilities that organizations need to have to thrive in the 21st century to meet the challenges that face them, they need to be daring. They need to have aspirations that create stretch and help people be really creative and demonstrate a lot of ingenuity. So think about SpaceX. Their aspiration is to make humanity interplanetary. Not many organizations have goals that lofty, but what we would say is that most organizations are not very ambitious. When they're challenged to do something new, their typical reaction might be, who has already done it, as opposed to thinking, is it worth doing? So organizations are not very daring. They're also not very resilient. So they have a hard time changing unless they have to change. And by the time they have to change because they need to respond to a crisis, they're often on their back foot. They're also not particularly creative or innovative. When we think about innovation, we typically think of a startup or an insurgent that is upstaging the incumbent. And that's not because large established companies don't have the resources or the ingenuity inside to be innovative. It's because they're just not capable of doing that. Even though most CEOs would tell you innovation is a top priority, I think most companies are not very good at it. And the last thing that large organizations are not good at, they're not particularly engaging. If you look at the Gallup numbers, Gallup is an American polling institute. They've done this long time survey around engagement at work. Worldwide, they find that 20% of people are fully engaged at work. In the US, it's a little higher, 33%, but it's still not a very high number. And what that means is that people might bring compliance to work. They might bring discipline to work. They might even bring their technical skills to work. And those are things that an organization can expect and command. But they're not going to bring their audacity. They're not going to bring their inspiration. They're not going to bring their initiative because those things are gifts that people give to the organization. And most of the time, people are saying, I'm not going to do that. You're not creating an environment where I'm motivated to give you these kinds of things. And our contention is that the root cause for that lack of ambition, that inertia, that incrementalism, that spiriting work environment has to do with a bureaucratic management model that is predicated on top-down authority and very ponderous administrative structures that lock the organization for the sake of control and compliance into a mode that doesn't allow for ingenuity, for initiative, creativity to really flourish. And so approval cycles are going to be very long. Ideas will need to move up the chain and they often get rejected. The question will be, what you can do in the next month, forget about long-term initiatives that might bear fruit in the next 2 years because those are hard to quantify. If you have an idea, but you're further down in the organization, you have no space to drive it forward because the people that make decisions are high up. Often these bureaucracies are administrative aristocracies where power isn't going to technical people that have the expertise to solve problems, but people who are administrators who allocate resources, set budgets, and things like that. And so the organization becomes conservative, slow, and less focused on solving real practical problems. And that's really what bureaucratic drag is. It's a set of categories around friction and disempowerment and conservatism, risk aversion that make it difficult for organizations to exhibit those qualities I mentioned earlier. And in the book, we have a little instrument called the Bureaucratic Mass Index where you can answer a set of questions and see where you are, because we think that quantifying some of the costs of bureaucracy is an important part for then getting the motivation to do something about it.
I've worked for some large corporates delivering technology projects and products, and it was astonishing how tremendously slow and inefficient they were internally. There was barriers and blockers everywhere. There's long delays and queues for things that you needed in order to build a product. And also this enormous amount of aggressive politics higher up where the message that you were trying to get help or get something unblocked would be converted into another story or just dismissed entirely as it went up the ranks because people in the middle wanted to please people at the top by telling them what they wanted to hear. And if they didn't, they got punished. So the people at the top didn't actually know what was going on in most of these organizations, even though they thought they did.
Yeah, and it's funny. A.G. Lafley was a longtime CEO of Procter & Gamble, who was a very accomplished executive, said the CEO can see things that others can't see. But often it's actually the opposite. They're the last people to know because they're insulated by layers and layers of people who don't want to deliver the bad news because that's often career limiting. And so you have this paradoxical situation where most of the power sits in positions at the very top that are often the most disconnected from reality. And by the time the news gets to them, it's too late. And there are examples after examples of this being the case, where they just don't have the right vantage point. And in fact, the other paradoxical thing about that pyramidal organization is that the biggest decisions probably are the ones that are least subjected to review and due diligence. So like if you're someone working in an operational unit and you want to get permission to go attend a conference or buy a chair or some other piece of furniture, you probably have to go through all sorts of hoops. But if you want to buy a company, the number of potential vetoes for you is much smaller and the stakes are much higher. So I always find that to be a strange way to organize work, where the things that are least consequential have the most scrutiny and the most consequential have the least.
I was just thinking about corporate organizations that I worked in. A lot of my work is explaining a technical thing to a non-technical person so a non-technical person can make a decision on it, which is slow and really difficult. It's really difficult to explain the consequences of something that you know well to somebody who doesn't know it, especially if they're going to pass it up in PowerPoint slides or weekly updates. No wonder things don't get resolved because there's only so much I can explain to somebody.
Yeah, and that's the big difference between a startup and like a big company. It's the ratio of makers to managers and the relative power they wield. So in a startup, it's the inventor, it's the engineer, it's the designer, it's the program that runs the show. But as the business grows, power shifts to the suits, to the accountants, to the controller, and they're trying to solve a problem. But the problem is not a practical problem necessarily. It's one around maximizing control, alignment, efficiency. And then slowly the organization becomes an administrative aristocracy. The bureaucrats take over. If you think about a company like Intel, which used to be the leading chip maker, and now it's an also-ran, or Boeing, which became the dominant aerospace company because of its engineering culture. And you see that they became colonized and taken over by the MBAs, by people that don't have the technical skills. And then when you see the world through an administrative lens, you will make different decisions. You will start to say, do I really need to develop this engineering culture and work really hard to sustain it? Or can I just outsource this piece to someone else and just manage in a more abstract way? And then what has happened in the case of Boeing and Intel is that the company has been all hollowed out, and they found themselves to be incapable of keeping up with the competition. And in the case of Boeing, leading to disasters that cost lives, it's more than just the numbers. There are some companies that have dual tracks for technical people and managerial people, but most companies don't. So if you are an engineer or someone with technical competence, if you want to make more money, if you want to have more of a say in the company, you have to give up your technical baggage and become an administrator. And that might have made sense when administrative skills were rare 100 years ago. But now it's much easier to turn a technical person into someone who could play the managerial role than the other way around. And I think one of the things that is common to all the companies we mentioned in the book is that this administrative aristocracy is far less important, and it is the makers that call the shots.
It's interesting that you would use the word aristocracy because it is very much a separate layer. It's self-perpetuating, it's focused on itself and maximizing its own power and income and wealth. That becomes the priority in many organizations rather than customers or shareholder value or workers or anything. It's about how do I keep my position and increase my power and income.
Yeah, and there's an ideology behind it too. We talk about bureaucracy as basically as a mashup of military command structures, where you have the officer corps, and then you have the grunts, and then industrial engineering. It's like Julius Caesar and Frederick Winslow Taylor had a baby, and that's the organizational template of most large institutions around the world. So strategic thinking or external awareness was only for the executives. And you're basically told 99% of the organization not to worry about the strategy, not to think about what competitors are doing, not to think about what else could we be doing to succeed in the marketplace. That's the job of those people at the top who think the big thoughts. And that's completely insane to me, because often the best ideas, the best insights come from the periphery. And so like your job as an executive is to create a system where those ideas are continually fed into the system and then tested and hopefully scaled if they work. But we hold assumptions about who makes decisions and how work is organized that don't make a lot of sense.
Yeah. I've done surveys a couple of times on LinkedIn with people where I asked, what proportion of your managers during your career have helped your team achieve the organization's goal? What proportion just ran the bureaucratic process? And what proportion have had a negative impact on your team's ability to achieve the organization's goal? Do you want to have a guess at what the proportions were?
Helpful, maybe 15, neutral, 30, unhelpful, 55.
It was a bit better than that. It was helpful, 25, neutral, 35, and harmful, 40%. But if you just think of that, 40 to 50% of the managers you have in your organization today are actively harming your team's ability to achieve the organization's goals.
The Gallup data shows that the big reason why people are disengaged at work isn't necessarily their role, but their manager they work with. They're the biggest driver of disengagement. And the response has always been, we just need to find the right person for that role. But this statistic has persisted for the last 20 years, and we're spending hundreds of millions of dollars on leadership development, management development, and it's not making much of a difference, which should prompt people to think about, maybe we have the structure wrong. Maybe there's another way to do this. Maybe we're not good at selecting managers, because most people are promoted by the people that they report to. And that doesn't necessarily correlate with that person's ability to lead, which is often better assessed by the people that work with that person. The people that remove a manager who's not very good typically put that person in there to begin with. So they're low to admitting that they made a mistake. And it's often painful to them because they're personally responsible for that choice. They may know that person very well, may like that person. And there's no mechanism to dynamically give power to the people that are adding value and take power away from the people that don't, because you're either a manager or you're not. In a lot of these companies that we talk about in the book, power and authority is often not correlated with formal role. It's something that waxes and wanes dynamically based on your value add. And there are mechanisms to make sure that if your team doesn't feel like you're adding value, you're voted off the island. And it happens pretty quickly because the team itself is saying, this is not working and we need an alternative. I don't want to be bashing managers throughout this podcast because a lot of those people are very capable, but they're also disengaged. They're also very unhappy because they're typically on the receiving end of a bureaucracy coming their way. It's a lose-lose system. And a lot of them, especially technical people, would be much happier if they didn't have to play this game. So it's a system that doesn't work for many people, including many of the managers that we were talking about.
Let's talk about the principles of humanocracy that you've written about in your book. Can you take us through them and how they work?
Sure. The whole idea of humanocracy isn't a very specific set of practices that everybody needs to espouse because they're not doing the same thing. They have different practices, but they are united by a set of principles that are more similar than alike. They've all thought about organizing and managing in different ways. So the important thing isn't so much to look at what they do, but rather how they think. And they operate with a different set of principles. In a bureaucracy, people are resources. In a humanocracy, people are the agents. The problem that a bureaucracy is trying to solve is one of conformance and control. The problem that humanocracy tries to solve is maximizing contribution. In a bureaucracy, the dominant principles are stratification, hierarchy, standardization, everything is done uniformly, formalization, people in specific roles, and specialization, just having people work on very narrow things. We have 7 principles in the book. Each gets a chapter. The first is ownership. So the idea is that most people, if they could, would rather be owners and employees. And while not everybody can work in a startup, a lot of the companies that we profile, whether it's Haier, which is the largest appliance maker in the world, they're based in China, or Vinci, which is the largest infrastructure company in the world based in France, they all work like mini startups inside a big company. So it's possible to create organizations where every team member has both the autonomy as well as the financial upside to feel and act like an entrepreneur. So that's number one, ownership. The second is meritocracy. And here, the idea is that you want to give people the chance to develop their skills and be recognized for their contributions, and where influence and compensation are correlated with competence and value added. And so how do you create systems where ideas compete on equal footing and everybody has the same opportunity to drive value? So that's number two. The third principle is markets. Markets are great at aligning needs and resources, certainly much better than centrally planned economies. Silicon Valley beats the Soviet Union because there's a market for capital and talent. But most companies actually work more like the Soviet Union. Capital is allocated top-down annually. That's typically not very dynamic or market-like, and we think that needs to change. We need to create market-like mechanisms, and a lot of these organizations do that. The fourth principle is experimentation. There's something that is deeply satisfying when we use your ingenuity to solve a problem, when you're testing the idea. Often problems are solved that way. They're not solved by spreadsheet or PowerPoint. In fact, in the book, we talk about Intuit as a really good example of decision by experimentation. They've created a whole system that encourages every employee to try new things, to prototype their way into new products and services, as opposed to doing a PowerPoint and getting 10 different sign-offs. Experimentation is principle number 4. Principle number 5 is community. The idea is that you want to work in an organization where your work is facilitated by deep, trust-based, horizontal relationships, where you feel like you're accepted, you're safe, And that's really when you do your best work, where the organization is more horizontal than vertical. That's principle number 5. Number 6 is openness. So how do you create organizations that are open to new ideas, where the boundaries between inside and outside are blurred, where you're tapping into the best contributions from wherever they are? And the last principle is paradox. It could also be called balance. And so all these organizations are able to reconcile conflicting goals like scale and agility, innovation and freedom and discipline, which requires them to reinvent control, because many of these organizations have a lot of control and a lot of discipline, but they get it in a different way. So these are the 7 principles, and then they will suggest a set of practices, but our plea to organizations that are thinking about these things is to not copy what Haier is doing or Buurtzorg is doing. Buurtzorg is the largest home healthcare service provider in the Netherlands. They have 10,000 nurses working in self-managing teams. Very interesting. But it's not necessarily doing what they do chapter and verse, but saying, okay, what is it that we can learn from how they take this idea of community, for instance, which is a big part of how they are organized. How do we make it happen in our organization? And how do we embed practices that fit our context, fit our culture, but still resonate with these principles?
I want to explore those principles a bit more, particularly the idea of having an internal market inside your organization for the allocation of goods and services and labor to different initiatives. Can you talk about how these markets work in organizations like Haier?
So Haier is the largest appliance maker in the world. They're based in Qingdao, China, which is halfway between Shanghai and Beijing on the coast. They have about 84,000 people. In the US, they own GE Appliances. In Australia, New Zealand, they own Fisher Paykel. So they own a bunch of brands, and they've been incredibly successful over the last 20 years in gaining market share and being profitable, and then inventing new ways of delivering products and services. They have not only smart devices, but networks of providers and partners where you just press a button on your refrigerator and say you want to make a particular dish, it'll just connect you to all these providers on their network, and things will appear at your house very quickly, and everything is all synced up. So they're very innovative as a company, and they have a management philosophy called Ren Dan Hoi. It's a mashup of Chinese characters that means users and employees creating shared values. And Zhang Rumin, the longtime CEO who's now emeritus, was the driver of this philosophy at Haier for the last 30 years. The idea is to create zero distance between the employees and the customers. And I'll just give you a few highlights of how they're organized. The core unit at Haier is the micro enterprise. And here I'm talking primarily of their Chinese operation, which is obviously the biggest, of about 60,000 people working there. So their workers are arrayed in about 4,000 of these micro enterprises. And some of these are customer facing, sales and marketing. Others take care of the distribution. Others are focused on designing new parts, new components. Others are factories. Others are service. And each is about 10 to 15 people strong. It varies a little bit. A factory is a little bit bigger than that as a micro enterprise. But still, the logic is making everyone feel like they're working in a startup. Their ideas count. They make the key decisions, not someone else. They can make things happen. Now, these micro enterprises have very ambitious goals, and typically they're set so that they're a multiple of the market or your nearest competitors. If the market grows 10%, your stretch target is 20%. You got to grow 2 or 3 times the size of the market. And the bolder the target you reach, the more compensation you unlock. And let me just talk about the market discipline, Murray, that you mentioned earlier, because you have all these micro enterprises. How do they come together? It's all well and good to disaggregate an organization, but if you want the organization to be more than the sum of the parts, you need to find ways for these different units to come together. So the way they do that is through contractual arrangements. So let's say you are the micro enterprise that is focused on a 3-door refrigerator brand, and you want to have an upgrade, a new model. You would put out a bid and to say, I want these kinds of specs for the cooling technology. This is the price point. Therefore, this is the cost structure I need to have. and so on. You put it out on an online platform, and then you'll start to get bids. You might get 3 different factories saying, we can make this at this price in this time frame. You might get different bids from different components saying, this is how we might solve this problem. Or you might also get different sales regions of China, which are different microenterprises, saying, we would commit to buying this many and selling it at this price. So you have all these bids, you put them together, and then you create a nexus of microenterprises that will work together on that particular project. And the interesting thing is that all the microenterprises, whether they're customer facing or not, all share in the benefits of that product as it goes into the market, depending on how well it does. So Zhang Rumin, the CEO, said everybody at Haier reports to the customer, and he was only exaggerating slightly, because if you're the factory microenterprise that has come on that project to build a new refrigerator, part of your compensation is, have you delivered on your contractual commitment to the microenterprise that asked for it? But part of your compensation is, has that product done well in the market? So you're on the hook as much as other microenterprises for the ultimate success in the market of whatever you're doing. And if you're not doing well, you won't be selected in future bids. So there's a competitive pressure here that if you're not doing your job, you're going to be disbanded. No one's going to come to you because they don't have to. You have multiple providers of services and you can choose from. I often speak to HR and other functional leaders who tell me, we're really focused on our internal customers. And then my question is, can they fire you? Because if they can't fire you, they're not your customers. They're more your hostages. So there's tremendous accountability at Haier to be responsive to the end customer and everything the customer needs because of this pressure. That's how it works. There is definitely competitive pressure and there is rivalry in some respects, but there are also ways in which you can get collaboration and consistency across all these different microenterprises. But that is how they've created a market system inside a large firm, and it's worked really well for them.
Why would you engage units inside the firm rather than ones outside the firm?
They can do both. So many of these microenterprises, if they're not happy with internal bids, they go outside. There is no fixed boundary. I'll give you a small example. So there's this group of 20-somethings 5 or 6 years ago who got into esports, people playing games competitively, and producing computers that had high-end hardware for gaming, really big graphics cards, massive fans to make sure the computer doesn't melt down. And Haier wasn't producing those. The head of the business that was making laptops said, it's not my job to tell them no. If they want to do them, I might give them some seed funding, but then they need to go to Taiwan and find someone else who can make this for them. And we might be able to help them with distribution and other things. And now that business has become a standalone business started by Haier employees. And it's, I think, listed now in the equivalent of the NASDAQ in China. And it's grown to be really successful. So it could be starting on the inside, but then it could draw operational capabilities from the outside, but also capital. And there are lots and lots of businesses at Haier that work like this. It's less common in their legacy white goods component, but for products that are new, Haier takes this approach where it doesn't really matter if it's inside or outside. That distinction doesn't really hold.
So this is the principle of openness.
Yeah, it's a combination. Haier actually has a very neat open innovation platform where problems get bid out to technical communities around the world, and you find solutions in the most unexpected places. Recently, I was in China. I was talking to them about creating these refrigerators that are flush to the wall. There's no space between the wall and the refrigerator, and that needed a set of joints to open the doors that were very different, and no one in the industry had done anything like that. And they found automotive joint producers that came up with the right solutions. And they have a system of gain sharing depending on the innovation and the contribution that different parties make. So they're the opposite of not invented here. They're open to anybody who's entrepreneurial and who has good ideas. And there's no big headquarters staff. The company is very disaggregated. And I think they operate in China with 60,000 people, maybe 4 layers of management, maybe 3. So it's super flat. And it's not that there aren't any managers. The fact is management is syndicated and everybody has the right incentives to make judicious decision because they have skin in the game and full accountability. And if they goof off or coast or are not adding value, there's no place to hide.
So what is the role of leaders and managers in humanocracy?
So managers and leaders still exist. Leadership is interesting because it's now become a synonym with manager. And if you actually trace the history of this, you'll see that manager had a big upsurge in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. Then it started to taper off, and then leader became the big thing because manager become like a tired brand and we wanted to refresh. And so we started calling everybody a leader because it's better to be called a leader than be called a manager. But to me, leader is anybody who's mobilizing resources and other people to do something of value. And if that's the way you define a leader, then everybody can be a leader. And you need to create a system where everyone can lead. The leadership team isn't just the 10 people at the top of the organization, it's everyone. But even an organization where everybody's a leader, there's still going to be a hierarchy. There's still going to be people who are the CEO or senior executives. There are far fewer of them, but they still have a role to play. I can give you an example from Roche Pharmaceuticals. They spent a lot of time to come up with a conception of leader and senior executive that is much less about directing and approving to being what they call a support function. So leaders are architects of a system that allows people to thrive and to unleash their own potential. It's easier said than done, but that is the fundamental difference. It's about creating a model of leadership that is distributed where everybody can play that leadership role. But for those people in positions of formal authority, they're less deciders and more like social architects. Do I have the right way in which we allocate resources? Are people thriving? How do I harness the collective intelligence of the organization? And what do I need to change? As opposed to saying, I need to make these decisions because everybody else can't.
This sounds like servant leadership.
It's very related to servant leadership for sure, where you're supporting, you're enabling. Servant leadership still has this connotation that there's some sort of hierarchical relationship where at the end of the day, you still have the power and you're just enabling others to thrive. It's very similar, but I think it's a bit more radical than that because your decision rights may even be more limited. Your job is to think about what new capabilities or new organizational practices I need to build for these teams to thrive. So you're not even running the team or leading the team in some sort of operational way. The team is self-managing.
Yeah. We talk a lot about this same sort of leadership model in Agile.
Yeah, it's very similar to that, I think.
Yeah. All right. So let's say you're in the executive of a large organization and you want to do this. Where do you start?
Yeah. So I'll give you an example from Roche. So Roche, the second largest pharma company in the world, they have about $50 billion in their pharma division. And the story begins about 2017, where the company faced three big challenges. The first is that a lot of their big drugs, which are oncology drugs, were approaching expiration in terms of IP protection. They also wanted to go beyond those drugs. So this required new changes in marketing, pricing, and go-to-market. And the third thing is that Roche, like many other incumbents, was facing big competition from emerging startups. And Roche's CEO at the time, whose name is Severin Schwan, said, we need a fundamentally more agile organization. But he's like, I'm not sure my team, the executives around me, believe this change is necessary. So he and the chief talent officer, whose name is Tammy Lowry, started with a very simple, humble, consciousness-raising program for executives. It was called Kinesis. It's like a 4-day program, and it ended up being really transformative. So what they did before this event is an assessment where they had to rate themselves and their peers on different leadership traits. Am I autocratic? Am I critical? Am I selfless? Do I have balance? Am I a good mentor? And so on. So they had to rate themselves and others for this. And then people got mapped into two different dimensions. Are you reactive more than you're creative? Are you more focused on tasks or are you more focused on relationship? And so these dimensions were rated on a circle, and people were put on the circle where their dominant traits were, as assessed by themselves and by their peers. And most of the executives were very controlling and very reactive. And then they asked them, okay, are you happy there? Where would you rather be? And most of them moved to a different side of this circle where it was about creating and relationships. And it was a really important moment for them because they realized being taskmasters and responding to problems as they arise from our teams is incredibly exhausting. We're working super hard, but it's almost like a car that goes 170 kilometers an hour in third gear. Eventually, transmission fails. And so they all agreed, we need to find another gear. We need to find a way to increase our impact per unit of time and effort. And how do we go from command and control to envision and enable? They started role-playing different ways in which they could do that. And they ended up each getting a coach that allowed them to model out different behaviors. Hey, let's have fewer review meetings. Let's have fewer interventions from our end. Let's delegate more decisions. Let's allocate more time for mentoring. So I think that's number one. You need to think about the change you need to make as a leader. The other thing that happened is that people were exposed to some of the companies we talked about earlier, whether it's Spertzorg or Haier or Nucor or Gore, and they realized bureaucracy is a choice. It's not a cosmological constant. We can change, and the status quo is not defensible. So we need to act differently. There wasn't a big program that got implemented top down, but the hope was some of our leaders will pick up the mantle and try to drive this, not only personally, but in their organization. And one of these people is Bill Anderson, who at the time was CEO of Genentech, the big biotech that was acquired by Roche. It's basically Roche's US organization. And he said, I want to not only try this on myself, but try it on my team. And so he created a similar workshop with his team and then said for the next year, we're going to come together every 14 days and we're going to think about what do we need to do as a team to create more entrepreneurship, more agility. And they worked both on the personal side, what do we need to do to work on ourselves, but then collectively, how do we create new mechanisms, new processes that unleash more capability? And they want everyone to feel four things. One is, do I feel like an owner? Does it feel like I'm running my own business? Number two, am I focused on the patient, the customer? The third is, am I collegial? Do I work well with other people? So I'm not a selfish entrepreneur, but I see opportunities to collaborate and add value more broadly. And then the last one is, am I empowered? Can I act decisively? So they thought, how do I do this? And they created different experiments for making this work, which I think will be familiar to you as agile experts. So they went from a functional organization where you had the drug and marketing team, the sales reps were separate and so on. They said, let's create autonomous squads that are responsible for market outcomes. So they created about a dozen of these. Each was responsible for a handful of products. They still had to liaise with different product groups, but they were independent. And so now all the different people, whether it's marketing, sales, clinical trials, whatever, they had a holistic view of the market and more importantly of the patient. So they created these self-contained autonomous units. The other thing that they did is they created a much more dynamic way to do planning and resourcing. So they got rid of targets at the product level, and then they created a system where the budgeting was much more flexible. Every month, these squad leaders met together, they shared detailed updates, market intelligence, near-term projections, and then based on this input, they said, these are the top priorities across all teams. There might have been some differences in the ranking between different priorities, but everybody had the access to the same data. So it was actually not too hard to come to an agreement. These are the biggest priorities. And then once those were clear, then they started to think about, okay, maybe I have too many resources as a squad relative to the priorities I'm pursuing compared to your priorities. So you should maybe have some of my marketing budget. And if you were trying to cache resources, you'd be called out. So this is a super interesting way of doing it where there's a total clarity on priorities and you would move resources around between teams. And this was done on a monthly basis. So they got totally rid of the budgeting process. They had no year-long, year-out plan. It was a monthly dynamic process that allocated resources based on priorities. And so these two things structurally, the squads and these dynamic and collaborative ways of allocating resources made a humongous difference They increased revenues by a quarter over 5 years. They did all this work by shrinking the pyramid, shrinking the layers, far fewer managers, and freed up billions in resources. Our listeners might find Haier a daunting example, like how in the hell would I get an internal market to work? But an example like Roche, which we're detailing in the new edition of the book, is an example of a company that wasn't born with those genes and wasn't really facing an existential crisis, but still mustered the conviction and then figured out how to make that transformation happen over the course of 5 years. And if others wanted to walk in Roche's footsteps, it'd be first, leadership matters. You don't have to be a CXO to light the fires of institutional renewal, but having an enthusiastic top team can definitely shrink the timeline. And so they were able to imagine an organization where their traditional job didn't exist anymore. And then they worked really hard with coaching and overtime to really reorient their minds and to share their authority. The second thing is that leaders can't do this by themselves. And the leaders at the very top sought a lot of input, a lot of help. They tried different experiments. Some worked, some didn't. I gave you the ones that worked, but it was all the fruit of a lot of consultation, a lot of experimentation, and not a lot of top-down programming. And the last lesson I would give you is that no matter how large or complex your business, you can do this. You can build an organization that is daring, that is resilient, that is inventive, and we can definitely do it. So that would be my challenge to our listeners. Can you look at a case like Roche and say, I can be as ambitious, as bold in imagining a model that is still not widespread, but definitely super impactful and effective?
Don, would you like to kick us off with summaries?
So we started off by talking about the problem that Humanocracy solves, which is all of the problems around organizations where bureaucracy doesn't allow them to be innovative or daring, where there are hierarchical problems, long approval cycles, lots of bureaucratic drag. Then we talked about the 7 principles of Humanocracy. So we've got ownership, meritocracy, markets, experimentation, community, openness, and paradox. And then the thing that I was thinking about and listening for the whole time we were talking was really how medium to big organizations could start implementing these ideas, because it sounded to me like that would be really difficult. But I really loved that example that you gave of Roche and how they started using the principles in a large organization by awareness and education. And as you were talking about that example, I could hear lots of examples of the principles in the process as well, like experimenting, prototyping. You said that they did a lot of role play around how things could work, which is a really prototypy way of thinking through change. I'm always in small organizations and I find large organizations really odd, but I could see how a larger organization could start to implement a lot of these principles and become much more human focused.
Yeah. And Donna, you make a great point, and I should probably emphasize it more. But the idea is to be very experimental in how you develop these practices. We talked earlier about management being a technology, and it's something you can prototype and you should experiment with. And you evolve your way to a new model by taking some steps that are risk bound and that prove your hypothesis, and then you scale those. You do that for products, but for some reason we have this mental block. We can't do it for HR practices or finance practices. Of course we can. How did we come up with those practices to begin with? They didn't come down from Mount Sinai. Someone invented them. But we somehow don't think about that in the context of management, but that's how it should work. Because if you rely on just top-down, prescriptive change processes, you're either going to get super incremental results on the one hand, or maybe very risky results on the other. It's a very blunt instrument when you have to prescribe everything, figure everything out from the center.
I could hear that there's an information and measurement aspect around everything as well. I couldn't imagine you could do any of this if you're not measuring what you're doing.
Yes, all these organizations have very, very granular information systems, and they're typically also transparent. So anybody in the system can see how everybody else is doing. And there's one example of this Scandinavian bank called Svenska Handelsbanken, and they have 11,000 people and 400 branches, many of which are in the UK. And each branch has a profit and loss statement, which is very unusual for a bank. Typically, branches are sales and marketing centers, and they just have some allocations. But they worked really hard to create a virtual P&L where they tie the loans that originate from that branch, and they're held to maturity at branch level. So you can get a very reliable sense of what is the economic contribution of that branch. And unless you have that, it's hard for you to have ownership and accountability as a business owner. If you are running an organization with thousands of KPIs, not a P&L, you're not getting ownership, you're not getting entrepreneurship, you're not getting accountability. Because you could always game it or say, this KPI is bad, but that KPI is good. I don't know if we have this in the book, but we interviewed the co-CEO of SAP a few years ago. And he said when he left SAP, then he went to become the chair of Maersk and Siemens. But he said, when I left, we had 3,000 KPIs. We created a system that was on autopilot and people's brains were put on ice. And so you need information systems that give you granular real-time information about performance, actual performance, not gameable performance of different units, and information transparency and super granular P&L information is essential.
Yeah. I think, reflecting on my experience in working with large organizations, that there's an enormous amount of wasted talent in those organizations, wasted ideas, wasted effort, and wasted money everywhere. And quite often it's surprising that these organizations can continue, but I guess they're very big. They have a lot of resources. They have a proven business model, product market fit. And the things that they do work, the bureaucratic factory model works. It just doesn't tap into all of the opportunities that they have within their own talented workforce. In fact, really, those sort of organizations just want you to be a cog in a machine.
Yeah, what counts is not so much resources, but resourcefulness. And large organizations don't tap into resourcefulness. And you're right to give bureaucracy its due. It was an extraordinary accomplishment when it emerged 100 years ago. It's why we don't grow our own vegetables unless we want to. It's why we can produce microchips at the 3 nanometer scale, which is, by the way, the length at which your finger grows in 3 seconds. So we're operating at that level of precision. So absolutely, you need discipline, you need precision. But in a way, those are necessary, but no longer sufficient. And we should expect more. We should expect high discipline, high reliability, but also high innovation. And that's really the challenge for executives.
Yeah. I think bureaucracies are very good at doing the same thing over and over again, consistently with low cost, like a McDonald's. But everything is new in software development or product development or service development or user experience design. And the bureaucratic way of doing things is extremely difficult whenever you're trying to do anything new.
Yeah, the other thing I would say to that is that people might say for mature industries, bureaucracy is still the right model. Industries that are mature through innovation become no longer mature. So even this idea that if the environment is stable, bureaucracy works. Well, what environment is stable? Look at automotive. It used to be a mature industry. And now we have EVs that have completely revolutionized the industry. And even retail and even McDonald's. That world where you have that stability no longer exists. It'll take time to transition because, as you say, companies can still make money in other ways. They're still big. And so whether it's through regulatory arbitrage or by becoming really big through M&A, it may take a long time if we just let them to move to a different model, which is why I think we need to create more accountability, more urgency. Just like we hold companies accountable for how much CO2 they emit, maybe we should do the same for bureaucratic drag.
The organizations you're talking about, Haier, Bertsorg, and Nucor and Roche, have had tremendous benefit from this. I would think they'd be getting both growth and profitability at the same time.
Yeah, they are. If you put yourself in the shoes of a CEO who says, okay, my choices are A, do the really hard work and become like Haier or become like Roche. It's going to take 30% of my time over the next 5 years. And it's just going to be backbreaking. Or B, I can just do buybacks, issue more dividends, buy a competitor, lobby for a regulatory break, do some tax arbitrage. That's easier. And so you probably do B before you have to do A. I often get this question, like, if this is such a great model, why doesn't it propagate more fully? But I do think that companies haven't had the pressure to change, and the tailwinds of globalization, you're finding new markets, just scaling what you do, low interest rate environment, in America anyway, steadily decreasing corporate tax rates and consolidation. Basically, you just become dominant. Those things have led to some complacency, and the companies haven't had the desire to make these transitions. The last time there was real fundamental attention placed on this in the United States was probably in the early 90s, when American companies were getting exposed to severe pressure from European and Japanese companies. So quality became a dominant mode of production in Japan in the 50s. And it only got taken seriously by American manufacturers in the 80s, only after the Japanese products started appearing on American shelves. It's not that people didn't know that quality is important, that it can be done in a factory setting. They did so many different benchmarking trips to Asia and invited Deming and others to explain what the Japanese were doing. But it was only after they felt the pressure that hopefully we won't have to go to that extent, and companies will be able to move here without facing a real existential crisis. But I do think that creating the expectations of stakeholders or investors that companies need to take this seriously is going to be important to make this happen more quickly. That's, I think, the reality. I'd be curious to get your take on Agile, because it seemed like it was poised to take over the whole corporate world, and I don't know if it has.
I think that the bureaucratic management structure has taken Agile and turned it into the opposite of itself. So corporate Agile has become, for most managers, a tool for micromanaging people using Jira. So what we see in corporations today that they call Agile is not Agile at all. It's a million miles away from it. Maybe it was too threatening, maybe because it was too bottom up, maybe because there was too many people making money out of certification and not actually making change. But fundamentally, the management aristocracy in organizations didn't want to do it. So they co-opted the words and turned it into something completely different. And so therefore you get this situation where there's about 10% of organizations that do Agile are getting really very substantial benefit from it, and the others are getting almost no benefit from it.
Yeah, that tracks to other movements, whether it's quality, TQM, and others, where the principles are fantastic, and then they get co-opted and bastardized and corporatized, and then they become like a patina of buzzwords and practices that are very surface level. And the other thing that happens for the 10% of companies that are true believers and adopters, my experience is that as soon as a CEO, whoever is the pioneer, leaves, it reverts to what it was. These things very rarely persist beyond one generation of managers or leaders who brought it in. It's really hard to institutionalize these things because the ecosystem is premised on bureaucracy, and people come and say, I've done it a different way in my other company, so why do I need to keep up this tradition? It's strange, it doesn't work, I never tried it, I get to call the shots and I'll do it the way I used to.
Yeah. I think changes in structure and process and business rules do last a while after there's a change of leader. So if you've made the really big changes like Haier have made, I find it hard to imagine that a new bureaucratic person is going to come in, and if they did, it would be quite difficult for them to go backwards.
I think so. And I don't want to end on a gloomy note, because I am very optimistic. We need to face reality, and given the problems we have, whether it's in government or in the corporate sector, we just need to fundamentally be much bolder. And I do think that there's more receptivity to this. One thing, I'd be curious to your take on this. There was a lot of hope during the pandemic that remote work or just deeply caring for people was going to usher in a new human-centric organization. But if you look at the numbers, it seems to me that we're going back to pre-pandemic practices and pre-pandemic outcomes of how people feel about their leadership team. We're realizing we need something that is even more fundamental than what was happening during the pandemic, and we need to be much more serious about it. That's my hope, and I'm seeing signs of that. Curious to get your take on it.
I think that the big traditional organizations are slowly declining, slowly losing market share and share price value. They're so enormous that they could maybe go for 30, 40 years slowly declining until they become 1% of their share market value that they used to be and fall off the top 500. And that's happening because of these very innovative new companies. Look at Tesla and SpaceX. We may not like Elon Musk's behavior, but those companies are just so different to the others in their space and so incredibly revolutionary and successful. It just shows you what's possible.
Exactly. And hopefully that's a spur. I hope we don't have to wait 30 years because we may not have that much time. I ran some numbers looking at the churn of companies in the Fortune 100, the largest American companies by revenue. And the interesting thing is the churn has markedly declined over the last 15 years. So it used to be that 1 out of 2 companies would not stay in the Fortune 100 for the whole 10 years. So I basically looked at one particular year, 10 years back, and how many companies stayed on the list for all those 10 years. It used to be 1 and 2. Now it's 4 and 5. So the big companies have entrenched themselves, not because they're fantastically capable companies, but because they just become enormous. And so AT&T is the largest mobile provider, and Telstra in Australia. They're not particularly good, but they're humongous. The same thing for insurance companies. And so it's become an oligopoly, and maybe the market will work its magic out over many years. But I'm passionate about the challenge of making these companies that have so many resourceful people, so many brilliant people. How do we create some pressure and some inspiration so that they actually try to do that before they go out of business?
What I'm worried about, Michele, is that by the time that there is this massive crisis, which is going to drive existential change, it's too late for them to do this sort of thing.
Yeah. So how do you change before you have to? I think with inspired leadership and with thinking, yeah, it's a worthwhile task. A lot of the CEOs that have done this are CEOs who says, this will be my legacy. This is what I want to be known for. I think we just need more people like that and create more of an expectation. That's what a leader should be doing, really.
Yeah, that's great. All right, let's wrap it up. So if our audience wants to learn more about this, what are some books that they could read? Obviously, Humanocracy, they should read that. What else would you recommend?
So for people that are interested in the history of management thinking, I would say The Age of Heretics by Art Kleiner. And he does a fantastic job at showing how there have been various dawns of progressive human-centric management in the past, and they all fizzled. And so the challenge is, how do we make sure this time it doesn't happen? So that's a very interesting book. I would say Frederic Laloux's Reinventing Organization. It is very thoughtful about laying out a different model. Hubert Joly's The Heart of Business is a very good book. Hubert is the CEO of Best Buy, which is a big box retailer here in the US. They were getting slaughtered by Amazon until he came on board, and he basically created a system where authority and initiative was pushed down to the store level and where the front line was listened to much more. And that led to a remarkable performance turnaround. And now Best Buy is no longer threatened and is doing really well. So that's a good book. I do think No Rules Rules, which is about Netflix, which is Reed Hastings, the CEO, and Aaron Meyer. It's an excellent book about the Netflix culture, but it's also quite crisp on the practices that Netflix has that ensure meritocracy. I think The Geek Way by Andrew McAfee. Andrew McAfee's written lots of very thoughtful books at the intersection of technology and management. He wrote Enterprise 2.0 many years ago, which is about collaborative technologies and how they would change the organization. This is more about the ethos of Silicon Valley, Tesla, and SpaceX. Like, how do you have engineering cultures shape management for the better? I think that's a great book. And there's a good one by Jerry Z. Mueller called The Tyranny of Metrics, which is about how obsessions with metrics and counting things drives organizations and systems to bad outcomes. And one shameless plug, if people are interested in some of more of these stories that I mentioned, including with Bill Anderson at Roche, Gary and I have a YouTube channel called The New Human Movement. And there's a set of videos there with different mavericks and CEOs who have done interesting things or have been thinking about this. We have a nice library of interviews if people want to dig into this more.
And is there any other way that people can get in touch with you if they want to organize some consulting or something like that?
Sure. My LinkedIn profile is pretty active and people can find me there. Or if they go to michelezanini.com, and people can find me there as well.
And you do that sort of consulting for organizations?
Yes, we do. It is really focused on how do you create high velocity experiments in management and how do you upskill people so that they can be entrepreneurial and innovative. Yeah, so those are the kinds of things I do.
Great. Fantastic. All right. Thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you.
Thank you, Donna. Thank you, Murray. It was lovely to chat with you. And I look forward to following your podcast from now on.
That was No Nonsense Leadership from Murray Robinson and Donna Spencer. If you'd like to explore better ways to develop software products and services, contact Donna on LinkedIn and Murray at evolve.co. That's Evolve with a 0. Thanks for listening.